Hello, everyone. We're going to continue with module number 3, rooting deeper and getting greener. And this is part of the workshop, Deep Time Paleobotany and Plant Evolution. So here we have a timeline of the whole history of the Earth. Earth formed roughly 4.6 billion years ago, and we divide the sedimentary layers of our planet up in different time intervals. So the time interval that we're mostly going to look at is the Phanerozoic. That includes the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. That means old life, middle life, and new life. And today, in this third module, we're going to look at the Devonian, the whole Devonian. So roughly 416 to 359 million years ago, when plants are slowly getting bigger. So vascular plants evolved already. Non-vascular plants were, of course, also still around. And gradually, the plants started to get bigger and bigger and bigger through the Devonian. And by the end of the Devonian, they're really big trees on the landscape. So here we are looking at a reconstruction by Hannah Bonner, and it's from one of her books. And this is a landscape from Quebec in Canada during the early Devonian. It says getting greener and getting buggier. Plants, some of the plants have developed roots and start to spread out over the landscape. They're not living further away from the water here in these hilly areas yet, so it's still not green. And there was still a lot of room around to move into, and a lot of the plants were mainly reproducing via runners, so vegetatively. So you see in this landscape a lot of different colored patches, and those different green colors represent different clonal patches of particular plant groups. So in this reconstruction, plants were probably roughly 3 feet or 1 meter high max, so still not very big. So how does that work, runners? Well, probably everybody has seen strawberries make runners, etc. Well, this is a reconstruction of how one particular plant was doing it, called Nothea. On the left, you see a reconstruction of Nothea. You see a body plan that is relatively similar as that of the other early land plant. There is an axis, it divides in two in an equal way. And again, some of those axes are fertile, and so have produced spores. But when you go to the bottom of the plant, you can see that they're rhizomes, so underground growing axes. Again, these are not roots yet. So what we think is that if you have a rhizome and an aerial shoot, like the ones you see on the left, departing, eventually the rhizome would split in two, and that new aerial parts would develop, in this case 2, it would split up again, etc., etc. And gradually you would end up with a big field of clones of plant parts. It could be that the first parent unit already died out, but it doesn't matter, they're genetically all the same. So that's how you relatively easy can conquer a whole area of land. So I mentioned that it was also getting buggier. With plants growing on land, it also makes more sense for organisms like arthropods to come out of the water as well, and also gradually to get adapted to life in the air instead of water. The earliest arthropods were not actually eating plants. Some of them have been eating rotting plant matter, and there were other ones that were actually hunting the ones that ate plant matter. So what we know from fossil deposit is that organisms like daddy longlegs already existed, that there were springtails already, and the possible oldest insect, what might have been the oldest insect was around, but we actually don't know what the body looked like. So slowly, ecosystems are changing. So when we go to the Middle Devonian, plants were already getting a bit bigger. So this is a reconstruction also from the US, from New York State, also by Hannah Bonner. And we see first trees with the first trees with relatively shallow roots, like the one here on the left. This is a lycopod, so it's a relative of those earlier lycopods that were already around in the early Devonian. And they rooted relatively shallow. They have knob-like bases with bifurcating roots. There were also smaller lycopods still around. But we see other groups of plants appear as well. And those plants, some of those plants are relatives to the ferns and the horsetails. So one of them that is relatively famous, and that was the tallest tree from that time interval, is the Gilboa tree. Here it says Eospermatopteryx, that is the Latin name. And when this reconstruction was made, they actually did not know what the top of the tree looked like because it wasn't found yet. And the bases of the trees, which are kind of odd actually, were relatively well known. So what did they look like? Well, the reason why they were well known is they were found on a regular basis apparently in a part of New York State, in quarries. And here's a picture on the left with one of those bases of those trees. So the whole base of the tree was fossilized. So this is from 1920. More of them have been found, but you can imagine when you find them like this, you have no clue what the top looks like. So relatively recently, they finally found material in one of the quarries that indicated what the upper part of the tree looked like. They found not exactly this part, but yeah, the whole canopy, including some of the branches that came off of it. So Bill Stein is one of those researchers that study that material, and here he is holding a branch in the middle. If you find something new in paleobotany, and paleobotanists often find things really, really cool, but the rest of the world not so much. But in this case, it did get a lot of attention, and it ended up in Nature with 2 different papers. So what was really interesting about it was that it was a tree without leaves. So far we talked about that until now it was still mainly the lycopods that were able to produce leaves. It turns out that this Gilboa tree, or Eospermatopteryx, was also not capable or was not producing leaves. So coming from the stems were branches that divided up, turning into kind of fluffy matter. And on the left is what a reconstruction of one of those trees could have looked like. So you have this really wide base, a big stem, and then at the top, these fluffy branches. So it in a way grew similar to how a palm grows, only up, making big branches on the sides, but there's only way up, and that's at the top, and not making any side branches. So this Gilboa tree, because they now had more information on the structure at the top and combined with the base, they were able to fit it in the group of ferns and horsetails. So it's a relative of ferns and horsetails. So the people who did these studies, they continue to do research in that area, and they found a locality with a fossil soil as well. And preserved in that fossil soil were actually the imprints of the roots. And there it became really interesting. They started to map out this area in grids. Every square is roughly 3 meters wide and 2 meters high, and they indicated where they found remains of different parts of rooting systems. And some of them were relatively familiar from them because they look like a dead ringer of those Gilboa trees. Other ones were more unexpected. It was much more complex rooting systems, much deeper, etc. And they realized that it was evidence for a group of plants that they did not expect to be around already at that time interval. Okay, so what are we looking at? So these more bigger root systems that went deeper are very likely evidence that a particular other plant group that we call the protracheophytes are present on the landscape already. And it's that lineage that leads up to the seeds plants. One of the most famous ones is Archaeopteris. I'm going to show you a reconstruction soon. But here is what this structure looks like, photographed. Then the other ones that looked relatively familiar to the people are those, the bases, more or less the remains of where those Eospermatopterus or Gilboa tree bases must have been. So this paper also ended up in Nature, and it was a breakthrough because we really did not expect these two groups lived together in the Middle Devonian already. So that means that really big trees were already around at that time interval. And if you just think back what we were talking about earlier, during the early Devonian, things did not get higher than 3 foot. So things are moving fast. So here we have a reconstruction of Archaeopteris, this so-called progymnosperm. Progymnosperm is this larger group, which means it's almost a seed plant. So they, if we would see them from far away, they would not look that unusual for us. They have woody stems, and some species actually do have leaves. So we now know that they, based on the research that I just showed you, that they appeared during the Middle Devonian. They were very widespread during the Late Devonian. And these are the first plants that produce secondary wood. So if they produced wood, it's secondary growth of vascular tissue. So not only a vascular bundle, but also secondary wood. And that is what most of the things we call trees nowadays do. So they had fern-like leaves and they were still producing spores. But if you would see them from afar, you might have thought it was a conifer. So the wood itself actually does look like some of the conifer woods. So I mentioned that some of them produce leaves. And here in this diagram where it says B up to E, it shows some of those leaf types. Some of them don't produce leaves. They still are just naked axes. But some almost look like flat ginkgo leaves. And we call these types of leaves megaphylls. Now, there is a picture at the bottom of one of those Archaeopteris leaves, and that's still relatively segmented. but through all those little tiny segments, there are vascular bundles present, or veins present. If you look at the diagram to the left, you can more or less see what I mean when I say megaphylls. It's different veins actually that are present in the leaf tissue instead of just one vein. And why is that important? Well, you probably remember that we were so surprised to find that lycopods were producing leaves earlier, right? We looked at the Middle Devonian plants earlier. There was a lycopod, and they already had relatively big leaves. And we also mentioned that leaves and roots evolved independently in this particular plant group relative to all the rest of the other vascular plants. So lycophytes produce microphylls. So they produce leaves with a single unbranched vein. A lot of the lycopods nowadays are relatively small and they have relatively small leaves. That's why we also call them microphylls. Like, for instance, in this Selaginella here on the right. But during Middle Devonian and later times, some of the leaves were actually relatively big. But the most important thing is they only have one single unbranched vein. So this microphylls versus in lycopods versus having multi-veined leaves in all the other plants is partly evidence for this big bifurcation that we see in the extant plants. So it was breakthroughs in paleobotany that made people realize that lycopods really evolved roots and leaves independently of all the other vascular plants. So plants with microphylls and megaphylls represent two different plant groups. This dichotomy goes back 450 million years at least to the late Silurian or early Devonian. So the time period that we looked at now in this module is the Devonian. We saw plants going from relatively small, 1 foot, 3 foot, up to relatively big, almost looking like conifer size, and they're rooting deeper and getting greener. They get leaves, and the groups that we saw just now, they include that are present during the Devonian include the earliest seed plants. We didn't talk about them. The earliest ferns appear on the landscape. Horsetail relatives are present, and a lot of the other plants that we talked about earlier, the smaller statured ones, where they're still as well. So things are getting complexer, and with those roots, plants are able to move further away from the wetter environments on the landscape. So that's another reason why our planet is getting greener. So I'm going to talk about the take-home points from this module number 3, rooting deeper and getting greener. So most vascular plant groups evolve, essentially all major groups or their ancestors, with the exception of the angiosperms, the flowering plants. There is organ differentiation. We see first through leaves, microphylls and megaphylls, stems and roots. The first trees and the first forest start to spread around on the landscape, and the first seeds. We're not going to talk about that. We can talk about that in another module, but not today, because there's only a limited amount of time. And now I'm ready to take some questions.